They called it the Aegis Block, a deep space black site designed to break the most dangerous beings in the cosmos. When they threw a bruised, unassuming Earthling into its deepest pit, the wardens expected him to beg. They didn't know human engineering. By dawn, the captive had become the warden. Warden Richter stood on the elevated observation deck, his hands clasped behind his back, looking down at the surveillance monitors with a gaze of absolute detachment. Below him, buried under 300 meters of reinforced titanium alloy and dense electromagnetic shielding, was Cell 9, the crown jewel of the Oak Haven Penitentiary. It was a maximum security black site located on a dead moon, operated by the coalition to house the worst political dissidents and terrorists in the quadrant. Today, it held a human. Richter leaned closer to the primary monitor. The human's name, according to the confiscated Earth registry, was Arthur Pendleton. He did not look like a threat. He was a civilian communications engineer, snatched from a merchant vessel near the disputed border regions. Arthur was of average height, mid-40s, with graying hair, a slight paunch, and a face bruised purple and yellow from the rough handling of Oak Haven's security team. He sat huddled in the corner of the stark white cell, his arms wrapped around his knees, shivering. "Is that it?" asked Captain Hayes, Oak Haven's head of security. Hayes sneered, adjusting the heavy sidearm holstered at his hip. "I thought these humans were supposed to be aggressive, unpredictable. He looks like a cornered rodent." "Do not let the physiological fragility deceive you, Hayes," Richter replied calmly, though his own voice carried a note of smugness. "The Coalition Intelligence Directorate sent him to us because he managed to decrypt a Class A military transmission before his capture. He possesses an intellect that makes him dangerous. But in Cell 9, intellect is useless. The cell is an absolute void." Hayes chuckled, crossing his arms. "I'll say. Kinetic energy dampeners on the walls, biometric locked doors, a localized gravity well, and an acoustic suppression field. Even if he screams, the sound waves are instantly neutralized. There isn't a single seam, a single wire, or a single mechanical flaw in that room. He is locked in a perfectly smooth, unbreakable box." Down in the cell, Arthur Pendleton coughed, a small, pathetic sound that barely registered on the internal audio sensors before the dampeners crushed it. He wiped a streak of dried blood from his chin and stared blankly at the floor. He had been stripped of his standard clothes and forced into a coarse synthetic gray jumpsuit. They had scanned him down to the molecular level, ensuring he possessed no cybernetic implants, no hidden tools, no concealed weaponry. Arthur let out a long, shaky breath. To the alien wardens watching through the cameras, he looked utterly defeated, a broken man coming to terms with an eternity of isolation. They couldn't see his eyes. If they had, they would have noticed they were not frantically searching for an exit, nor were they wide with terror. His eyes were perfectly, terrifyingly still. He was tracing the microscopic grooves of the floor plating. Arthur had spent 22 years maintaining deep space communication arrays in the asteroid belts of Sol. He knew how machines breathed. He knew that perfection was a theoretical concept, not an engineering reality. Everything had a seam. Everything had a frequency. Everything required power. He shifted his weight, pressing his back against the cold, seamless wall. The guards, two hulking men named Miller and Davis, had thrown him in roughly, boasting about the impossibility of the cell. They had bragged about the acoustic dampeners and the localized electromagnetic field. That was their first mistake. An engineer doesn't need to see the blueprints if the enemy is arrogant enough to explain the physics. Acoustic dampeners, Arthur thought, keeping his breathing slow and measured. That means there are microsensors embedded in the walls, designed to detect audio frequencies and immediately broadcast inverted sound waves to cancel them out. He slowly reached up, rubbing his bruised jaw, his tongue pressed against his upper left molar. 10 years ago, Arthur had chipped a tooth on a piece of hardened ration bread during a long-haul flight. He couldn't afford standard bioenamel reconstruction, so a cheap back-alley dentist had filled the cavity with a microscopic drop of industrial tungsten alloy paste. It was practically nothing, a speck of metal weighing less than a fraction of a gram. The Oak Haven molecular scanners had registered it as inert medical waste. Arthur smiled, a tiny, imperceptible curvature of his lips. He closed his eyes and began to wait for the prison's night cycle. Up in the observation room, Richter watched the human close his eyes and apparently surrender to sleep. The warden turned away from the screen. "Leave him be for the night. Let the silence crush his spirit." Tomorrow morning, we pull him out for the first round of interrogation. I want the decryption keys he stole, and I want them before the Coalition envoy arrives. Understood, Warden, Hayes said, offering a crisp salute. Miller and Davis are stationed outside his door. He isn't going anywhere. The lights in cell 9 dimmed to a dull, oppressive red, signaling the artificial night cycle. The ambient temperature dropped exactly 4 degrees, another psychological tactic designed to induce physical discomfort and prevent deep sleep. Outside the heavy Durasteel vault door of cell 9, guards Miller and Davis sat at a security console. I don't get it, Davis grumbled, leaning back in his chair and taking a sip of a synthetic caffeine substitute. Why do we have to pull a double shift guarding a single cell? The guy is a glorified radio operator. And he's human. A strong breeze could snap his spine. Miller, older and more cynical, didn't look up from his datapad. Because Richter is paranoid. And because humans are a wild card. You heard what happened at the Sirius outpost? A squad of their Marines held off a coalition battalion for 3 days using nothing but jury-rigged explosives and raw stubbornness. He's not a Marine, Davis scoffed. Look at him on the monitor. He hasn't moved in 4 hours. Inside the cell, Arthur was indeed perfectly still, but he was far from asleep. With agonizing slowness, keeping his movements hidden beneath the folds of his gray jumpsuit, Arthur reached into his mouth. Using his thumbnail, he scraped aggressively at the old dental filling. The metallic tang of blood filled his mouth as he dug into his own tooth, ignoring the sharp flares of pain. It took him nearly an hour of microscopic, agonizing scraping to dislodge the tiny shard of tungsten alloy. He spat it into his palm. It was smaller than a grain of sand. Next, Arthur needed static charge. The synthetic jumpsuits were notoriously uncomfortable because they didn't breathe, but the friction of the cheap material against the floor plating generated a minor static field. Arthur began to subtly shift his back against the wall, sliding up and down a fraction of an inch at a time. To the cameras, it looked like the restless twitching of a cold man trying to get comfortable. He held the tiny tungsten shard between his thumb and forefinger, pressing it against the wall near the floorboard. If there are acoustic dampeners, there must be a feedback loop, Arthur reasoned. If I introduce an anomaly, a frequency too high for the dampeners to categorize, coupled with a localized static shock to disrupt the microsensor, I might force a system reset. Arthur began to tap. He didn't use his knuckles. That would be too loud, too obvious. He used the edge of the tungsten shard, scratching it against the supposedly impenetrable titanium alloy in a highly specific, rapidly alternating rhythm. It was a variation of high-frequency Morse code, but compressed. He was trying to find the resonant frequency of the wall's internal microsensors. Scratch, scratch, tap. Scratch, tap, scratch. The acoustic dampeners instantly kicked in, absorbing the microscopic noise. The cell remained perfectly silent, but Arthur knew the physics of anti-sound. To cancel a sound wave, the wall had to expend energy, projecting a mirror wave. By rapidly shifting the frequency and pitch of his scratches using the dense tungsten, he was forcing the wall's localized sensors to constantly recalculate and fire. He sped up. His fingers cramped. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he kept his face buried in his knees, shielding his expression from the overhead camera. After 2 hours of relentless, silent scratching, he felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible vibration in the wall. The localized processor behind the titanium plate was overheating. It was trapped in an infinite feedback loop, trying to cancel out a sound wave that kept shifting fractions of a hertz faster than the system could process. Arthur pressed his statically charged thumb against the heated spot. A microscopic pop echoed in the cell, a sound the dampeners failed to catch. A hairline fracture in the wall's invisible electromagnetic shielding opened up. It was no larger than a keyhole, but for a master engineer, it was a wide-open door. He brought his face close to the wall, pressing his lips against the invisible gap. He began to hum. He hummed at a low, guttural frequency, pushing the sound directly through the breached shielding into the cell's internal wiring cavity. He was essentially using his own vocal cords as a crude sonic drill, targeting the biometric locking mechanism's exposed data line. Outside at the guard station, a small yellow light blinked on Davis's console. "Hey," Davis said, frowning at the screen. "I'm getting a minor voltage fluctuation in cell 9. Environmental controls." Miller sighed heavily. "It's a glitch. The acoustic dampeners in that block have been drawing too much power since they installed the new firmware. Ignore it. You sure? Protocol says we should run a diagnostic. Do you want to wake up Captain Hayes at 3 in the morning to tell him his unbreakable cell has a flickering light bulb? Miller asked dryly. Davis hesitated, then cleared the notification. Right. Never mind. Inside the cell, Arthur felt the heavy, oppressive hum of the room shift. The biometric lock on the inside of the vault door relied on a closed-circuit logic board. By pushing the acoustic feedback loop through the breached shield, Arthur had successfully shorted the internal relay. The door was still magnetically sealed from the outside, but the internal override, the mechanism designed to trap him inside, was now dead. Arthur stopped humming. He slipped the tiny piece of tungsten back into his pocket. He wiped his bleeding thumb on his pants and stood up. The cowering, broken man was gone. He rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck. He walked directly to the heavy vault door. To the side of the door was a flush, glowing blue panel, the internal access port. Arthur didn't have tools. He didn't have weapons. But he had a dead circuit and a pool of latent energy behind the panel. He spat on his fingers, coating them in saliva to increase conductivity, and pressed both hands flat against the edges of the dead panel. He began to apply pressure, using every ounce of his strength to pry the casing loose. His fingernails cracked. Blood seeped from his cuticles, mixing with the saliva. With a sickening crunch of tearing composite, the panel gave way, exposing a nest of fiber optic cables and glowing power conduits. Arthur smiled. "Let's see what you're made of," he whispered to the wires. Over the next 3 hours, Arthur worked in absolute darkness, using only his sense of touch and his encyclopedic knowledge of coalition power grids. He systematically bypassed the environmental controls, routing the cell's primary kinetic barrier energy directly into the floor plating just beyond the door. He created a closed-circuit loop, turning the immediate threshold of the cell into a massive, dormant stun trap. He stripped the insulation from a high-voltage wire using his teeth, wrapping the exposed copper around the manual override lever hidden inside the wall. By the time the artificial lights in the cell began to shift from red to a harsh, blinding white, signaling the morning cycle, Arthur was sitting cross-legged in the center of the room. His hands were tucked neatly into his sleeves to hide the blood. He was waiting. At exactly 0700 hours, Warden Richter strode into the observation deck, a steaming cup of dark liquid in his hand. Captain Hayes was already there, looking sharp and rested. "Status on the prisoner?" Richter asked, not looking at the monitor yet. "He didn't sleep a wink," Warden Hayes reported, grinning. "Sat in the corner most of the night. About an hour ago, he moved to the center of the room and just sat down. The silence broke him. He's catatonic." Richter looked at the screen. Arthur was sitting cross-legged, staring blankly ahead. "Excellent. The psychological degradation was faster than I anticipated. Bring him up to interrogation room 4. Let's get those decryption keys." "Yes, sir." Hayes tapped his comms. "Miller, Davis, I'm coming down. We're pulling the human out." Deep in the Aegis block, Miller and Davis stood up, stretching their stiff muscles. The heavy blast doors at the end of the corridor hissed open, and Captain Hayes marched down the hall, flanked by 2 more armed guards. "Open it up," Hayes commanded, gesturing to Cell 9. Davis tapped his security clearance into the console. The massive magnetic locks disengaged with a deep, resonating thud. The heavy vault door hissed, venting pressurized air, and slowly slid open. Captain Hayes drew his stun baton, stepping into the doorway. "All right, Pendleton. On your feet. It's time to talk." Arthur didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on Hayes. "I wouldn't step inside if I were you, Captain," Arthur said. His voice was raspy from disuse, but it was remarkably calm. There was no fear in it. Hayes let out a sharp bark of laughter. "Are you giving me orders, human? You're in no position to." Hayes took a step forward, his heavy combat boot crossing the threshold and landing firmly on the metal floor, plating inside the cell. Click. It wasn't a mechanical sound, but the sudden, sharp crackle of arcing electricity. The trap Arthur had spent hours building closed instantly. The rerouted power from the cell's kinetic barriers, carrying nearly 4,000 volts of non-lethal but paralyzing energy, surged up through the floor, plating directly into Hayes's boots. Hayes convulsed violently, a strangled gasp escaping his throat. His muscles locked up instantly, and he collapsed forward like a felled tree, hitting the ground with a heavy crash. His stun baton clattered across the floor. "Captain!" Miller shouted, lunging forward to grab Hayes's shoulder. The moment Miller's hand touched the electrified armor of his captain, the current jumped. Miller let out a sharp cry, his body seizing as he fell to his knees. Davis and the other two guards scrambled back, raising their pulse rifles in panic. "Hold it! Hold it right there!" Davis screamed, his aim shaking as he pointed the weapon at Arthur. Arthur calmly uncrossed his legs and stood up. He walked over to the twitching, paralyzed body of Captain Hayes and casually picked up the fallen stun baton. "I warned him," Arthur said softly, looking at Davis. "Now, Guard Davis, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The floor plating, extending exactly 3 meters from this doorway, is heavily electrified. If you step forward, your nervous system will reboot. If you shoot me, my thumb slips off the dead man's switch I've wired into the environmental controls." Arthur pointed with his bleeding thumb toward the ripped-open access panel on the wall, where a cluster of exposed wires hung precariously. If that switch triggers, the entire localized gravity well in this block inverts. You'll all be crushed against the ceiling with the force of 10 Gs before you can blink. Davis swallowed hard, lowering his rifle slightly. "You're bluffing. You couldn't have bypassed the gravity controls." Arthur smiled, a chilling predator's smile. "I'm an engineer, Davis. I spent 10 years fixing the junk your coalition sells to the outer colonies. Your tech isn't unbreakable. It's just expensive." Up in the observation room, Warden Richter slammed his fists against the console, his eyes wide with shock. "What is happening down there? Talk to me!" Arthur reached down and unclipped the long-range comms device from Captain Hayes' belt. He tapped the frequency, looking directly up at the hidden camera in the ceiling of the cell. "Warden Richter." Arthur's voice echoed clearly through the speakers in the observation deck. "Good morning." "Pendleton," Richter snarled, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You have no idea what you've just done. You are in a maximum security black site. There are 300 armed guards between you and the surface. You will not leave that cell alive." "I think you misunderstand the situation, Warden," Arthur replied, pacing slowly within the safe zone of his cell. "I don't need to leave this cell. I have your head of security and your senior guard unconscious on my floor. I have complete access to the localized power grid of Aegis Block 4. I am looking at your firewall architecture right now, and frankly, it's embarrassing." Richter's blood ran cold. "What do you want?" "First," Arthur said, his tone shifting from casual to commanding, "you are going to lock down this sector. Seal the blast doors. If any other guards come down that hallway, I invert the gravity and turn your men into paste. Second, you are going to patch my comms through to the Coalition Envoy's ship that is currently orbiting this moon. And third," Arthur paused, looking down at Hayes, "you're going to order me a decent breakfast. I've had a very busy night." The meter-thick, titanium-reinforced blast doors of Aegis Sector 4 slammed shut with a finality that shook the very foundations of the subterranean prison. A cascade of heavy pneumatic locks engaged, followed by the deep, humming resonance of localized electromagnetic seals locking into place. Arthur, an unconscious Captain Hayes, a paralyzed Guard Miller, and a profoundly terrified Guard Davis were now completely sealed off from the rest of the facility. 15 minutes of agonizing, tense silence passed in the corridor. Then, a soft chime echoed from the wall just outside Cell 9. The automated food delivery chute, entirely governed by a separate rudimentary physical subsystem that Arthur had intentionally left intact, hissed open. A small metal tray slid smoothly into the corridor. It contained a block of gray synthetic protein oats, a cloned apple, and a steaming, insulated cup of genuine, imported Earth coffee, a luxury item requisitioned specifically for high-value interrogations. Arthur stepped carefully over Hayes' twitching form, retrieved the tray, and lifted the cup. He inhaled the rich, bitter aroma, closing his eyes for a brief moment of genuine appreciation. He took a slow, savoring sip. Up in the observation deck, Warden Richter paced the length of the command center like a cornered predator. The sterile, calm environment of Oakhaven had disintegrated into absolute bedlam. Alarms were blinking on every console, and the air was thick with the ozone scent of overheated processors. Beside Richter sat Chief Technician Bradley, a young, brilliant alien whose hands were flying frantically across 3 different holographic interfaces. Bradley was drenched in a cold sweat, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional awe and sheer, unadulterated terror. "I don't understand, Warden," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking as he wiped his brow. "He's inside the primary subnet. He bypassed the entire secondary firewall using a raw binary loop transmitted directly through the biometric scanner's power conduit. It's like he's picking a state-of-the-art quantum digital lock with a rusty crowbar. The system isn't registering it as an attack because it's too structurally primitive to trigger the countermeasures." "Then block him!" Richter roared, slamming his heavy fist onto the console, fracturing the glass display. "Cut the power to that entire block. Starve him of energy." "I can't!" Bradley yelled back, his panic completely overriding military protocol. He didn't just hack the local grid digitally. He physically rewired the environmental control logic board using raw copper and his bare hands. "If I sever the main power feed, the physical failsafe he installed triggers instantly. The moment the voltage drops, the dead man's switch snaps shut and the localized gravity inverts to 10 Gs. He literally holds the entire sector hostage. If I touch the power, he turns your men into paste." Richter pressed his hands against his temples, trying to slow his violently racing heart. How? The question burned like acid in his mind. He is a human, a dirt world mechanic, a postman. The Coalition had spent trillions of credits developing Oakhaven. It was a flawless fortress, designed by the greatest architectural minds in the quadrant, specifically to break the unbreakable. "Warden Richter." Arthur's voice suddenly crackled over the intercom, smooth, polite, and completely unbothered. "The coffee is surprisingly acceptable. I appreciate the gesture. Now, about that open line to the Coalition envoy?" Richter leaned heavily over the central microphone. "You are vastly overplaying your hand, Pendleton. The envoy is Director William Sullivan. He commands a heavy cruiser currently in high orbit above this moon. If you think taking a few guards hostage will earn you a pardon, you are severely underestimating Coalition protocol. We do not negotiate with terrorists, and we certainly do not negotiate with humans." "Who said anything about a pardon?" Arthur replied, taking another loud sip of his coffee. "And I'm not a terrorist. I'm a communications engineer. Put Sullivan on. You have 30 seconds before I start testing the upper limits of your gravity inverters." Richter gritted his teeth so hard his jaw ached. He nodded sharply at Bradley. The technician desperately routed the communication array, linking the isolated intercom of Cell 9 directly to the orbiting Coalition heavy cruiser, the Sovereign. A moment later, the deep, aristocratic, and fiercely arrogant voice of Director William Sullivan filled the observation deck and the subterranean cell below. "Warden Richter, I was explicitly told the human prisoner had been secured for standard interrogation. Why in the name of the Founders am I being patched into a localized hostage negotiation?" "Director Sullivan," Arthur interjected smoothly, before Richter could utter a word. "My name is Arthur Pendleton, Earth registration number 8472, Delta. I am the man who intercepted your Class A military transmission near the Outer Rim." "Ah, Mr. Pendleton," Sullivan replied, his tone dripping with profound disdain. "The little thief. You caused quite a bureaucratic headache for Coalition Command, but your little stunt is over. Relinquish the decryption keys you stole from that transmission, and I will personally ensure your execution is swift. Defy me, and Warden Richter will leave you in that cell to rot in absolute silence for a century." Arthur chuckled. It was a genuine, hearty sound that deeply unnerved every alien listening to the broadcast. "Director, you really need to review your intelligence reports regarding Earth. Humanity didn't survive our chaotic, fractured history by playing by the rules of our betters. We survived by adapting. We survive by taking our enemy's greatest strengths and turning them into fatal weaknesses." Arthur set his coffee cup down on the jagged edge of the ruined access panel. His bloodied hands flew over the exposed wires, connecting, disconnecting, and bridging delicate circuits with lightning speed. "You brought me to Oakhaven because it's the absolute most secure facility in the sector," Arthur continued, his voice echoing ominously through the warship and the prison. "You brought me to a place completely air-gapped from the galactic holonet, buried under 300 meters of rock, and surrounded by multi-spectrum electromagnetic shielding. You thought you were locking me in an inescapable vault." A series of blaring, high-pitched red warning alarms suddenly flared to life across Chief Technician Bradley's screens, painting the room in a bloody hue. "System alert. Unauthorized data transfer initiated. Source: Cell 9, Aegis Block. Destination: Oakhaven Deep Space Telemetry Antenna." "What is he doing?" Richter demanded, grabbing Bradley by the collar of his uniform. He's bypassing the internal kinetic dampeners, Bradley shouted, his hands trembling violently. He's rerouting the cell's acoustic energy field and using it as a localized signal amplifier. He's overriding the main telemetry dish on the surface of the moon. Arthur's voice dropped its casual, polite tone. It became hard, cold, and utterly authoritative, the voice of a soldier executing a flawless operation. You assumed I was running from you when you caught me on that merchant vessel. You assumed I intercepted that transmission by accident. But I didn't. I let you catch me. I let you beat me, and I let you drag me to this black site. Because Oakhaven is the only facility within 100 light-years that possesses a subspace antenna powerful enough to broadcast an unblockable omnidirectional signal across 3 star systems simultaneously. "Shut him down!" Sullivan roared over the comms, his aristocratic composure entirely shattering. "Richter, if he broadcasts those files, I will have you executed. Cut the hard lines." "I'm trying!" Richter screamed, frantically tearing at the console with his own hands. "The decryption keys I stole weren't for me," Arthur said, his voice now booming over the entire prison's primary PA system, drowning out the alarms. "They were the keys to your own encrypted shadow archives. The concrete proof of the Coalition's illegal bioweapons testing on the Outer Rim colonies. The financial ledgers proving Director Sullivan has been embezzling disaster relief funds to build a private fleet of dreadnoughts. The DNA manifest of every political dissident you've illegally executed in this very prison." Ping. A bright green light flashed on Arthur's makeshift, jury-rigged console. "And I just sent all of it," Arthur said softly, his voice echoing in the dead silence that followed the ping. "To the Earth Defense Council, the Centaurian Free Press, and every independent, unaligned news agency within 50 parsecs. I bypassed your encryption. It is broadcasting in raw, uncompressed text. There is no taking it back." Total silence fell over the observation deck, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans. Richter stared at the monitor, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The human hadn't just broken out of the most secure cell in the galaxy. He had engineered the complete political and structural collapse of the entire coalition, using nothing but a chipped tooth, static electricity, and an unbreakable room. Absolute chaos erupted within the Oakhaven Command Center, shattering the sterile, disciplined atmosphere the facility had maintained for decades. Klaxons blared at deafening volumes, bathing the observation deck in harsh, strobing crimson light. Holographic interfaces flickered and fractured as the station's processing cores desperately tried to manage the overwhelming data surge Arthur had initiated. "Director Sullivan!" Warden Richter yelled into the primary comms channel, his voice cracking with a desperation he had never known. "Director, we need immediate tactical support! The containment protocol has—" The line went dead with a hollow hiss of static. The heavy Coalition cruiser in orbit, the Sovereign, had abruptly severed the connection, entirely abandoning the black site to scramble and run damage control on the catastrophic intelligence leak. Sullivan was a politician and a survivor. The moment the Shadow Archives hit the galactic networks, Oakhaven became a radioactive liability. "Warden!" Chief Technician Bradley cried out, his hands flying across a secondary terminal. His uniform was soaked in sweat, his eyes wide with an expression bordering on sheer madness. "Look at the long-range scanners. Subspace ruptures detected. Multiple slipspace signatures are dropping out of faster-than-light transit just past the moon's upper gravity well." Richter lunged across the console, staring at the tactical display as spatial distortions blossomed into real space coordinates. "Is it a Coalition reinforcement fleet? Did Sullivan send the reserves?" "No, sir," Bradley whispered, his voice completely drained of hope. "The transponder codes. They're Earth Defense Force. I'm reading 3 heavy stealth frigates, a squadron of tactical interceptors, and a dreadnought-class carrier. The EDF Dauntless is actively hailing us. They have target locks on our primary orbital defense batteries." "Sir, the humans bypassed our deep space perimeter completely." Richter slumped heavily against the main console, the cold metal biting into his palms. The human hadn't just leaked the data to the press. He had broadcast a highly encrypted coordinate package directly to the human military. The Earth Defense Force had likely been waiting in the slipspace currents for weeks, lurking in the dark, waiting for the precise signal to drop out of stealth and launch a surgical rescue operation. Down in the subterranean depths of the Aegis block, Arthur Pendleton was entirely unbothered by the galactic incident he had just sparked. He calmly, methodically disconnected the raw copper wires from his makeshift console, wrapping them neatly with his bruised fingers. The primary task was complete. The data was out, the fleet was here. Now, he just had to walk out the front door. Guard Davis remained pressed firmly against the far wall of the corridor, his pulse rifle lowered, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep a grip on the weapon. He stared at the human as if Arthur were a demon conjured from the void. You're completely insane, Davis stammered, his breath hitching. You're a dead man. The Coalition will bomb this entire moon from orbit before they ever let you leave. They will turn this facility into a crater. They won't have the time to try, Arthur replied mildly, stepping over the threshold of Cell 9. The localized stun trap he had meticulously built was now completely drained of power, having dumped its entire latent electrical charge into the subspace broadcast sequence. Arthur bent down and retrieved the unconscious Captain Hayes' master access keycard, clipping it efficiently to his own synthetic gray jumpsuit. He paused and looked at Davis, offering a remarkably gentle nod. I highly suggest you check your captain into the medical bay immediately. He'll have a severe migraine, some minor peripheral nerve damage, and perhaps a bruised ego. But he will live. You, on the other hand, have exactly 4 minutes before the EDF mechanized Marines breach the main airlock. I suggest you drop the rifle and find a comfortable place to sit. Up in the observation deck, Richter's voice echoed over the PA system one last time. It was thick with venom, driven by the furious, flailing pride of a defeated man. Pendleton, do you hear me? Even if your human fleet is here, you are buried beneath 300 meters of rock. You are locked behind 6 distinct layers of reinforced magnetically sealed durasteel. You cannot walk out of the Aegis block. Arthur walked up to the massive, impregnable blast door at the end of the Sector 4 corridor. He held up the heavy, metallic stun baton he had taken from Hayes, testing its weight in his hand. He didn't attempt to hack the door's adjacent panel. He didn't begin rewiring any exposed circuits. He simply looked up at the corner security camera, his bruised face breaking into a wide, triumphant smile. Warden Richter, Arthur's voice carried smoothly through the internal microphones. I spent 22 years maintaining and repairing deep space communication arrays for the outer colonies. Do you know what happens when you abruptly redirect 90% of a highly secure facility's power grid through an unshielded subspace telemetry dish to broadcast an uncompressed petabyte-scale data package? In the command center, Bradley's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. He scrambled to pull up the reactor telemetry charts, watching the digital bars spike deep into the red zone. Sir, Bradley choked out, backing away from the console. The thermal exhaust. The primary plasma generators. They can't vent the heat fast enough. Kaboom! A massive subterranean tremor shook the entire Oak Haven facility, violent enough to throw Richter to his knees. Dust and ceiling debris rained down in thick clouds over the observation deck. The primary plasma generators, pushed far beyond their absolute safety limits by Arthur's forced, continuous broadcast, had undergone a catastrophic, localized emergency shutdown to prevent a nuclear meltdown. Instantly, the blinding, clinical white lights of the prison died. They were replaced a second later by the dim, flickering amber glow of emergency auxiliary battery power. More importantly, the massive electromagnetic locks on every blast door in the Aegis block locks, which required a constant, colossal stream of raw voltage to remain securely sealed, disengaged simultaneously with a series of heavy, echoing, metallic clanks. Arthur stepped forward and pushed his flat palm against the heavy durasteel door. Devoid of its magnetic anchor, the multi-ton barrier slid smoothly open on its physical tracks, offering absolutely zero resistance. Checkmate, Arthur whispered to the dead camera lens. He walked out into the long, dimly lit central corridor of the Aegis block. As he passed the other maximum security cells, he casually swiped Captain Hayes' master keycard against the emergency physical release panels. The heavy doors hissed open one by one. Confused, battered, and heavily scarred political prisoners of a dozen different alien species stepped out tentatively into the hallway. They blinked in the amber light, staring in absolute awe at the bruised, middle-aged human in a cheap gray jumpsuit who was casually leading them out of hell. 10 minutes later, the massive outer airlock of the Oak Haven Penitentiary was violently breached. A tactical squad of Earth Defense Force Marines, clad in heavy, scarred, mechanized assault armor and wielding high-yield plasma rifles, stormed through the churning smoke into the primary receiving bay. They expected a brutal close-quarters firefight. They expected to fight tooth and nail through hundreds of highly trained coalition guards to reach their stranded operative. Instead, the Marines froze, their weapons lowering as the smoke cleared. They found Warden Richter and his entire elite security detail sitting defeated on the floor of the receiving bay, their weapons neatly piled in the center of the room. They were completely surrounded by a massive, silent, and intimidating crowd of liberated alien prisoners. Standing at the very front of the crowd, leaning casually against a structural pillar, was Arthur Pendleton. He was holding a half-empty cup of genuine Earth coffee. Commander Reynolds, the imposing, battle-hardened leader of the EDF Marine Squad, holstered his sidearm and lifted his armored visor, staring at the lone, unarmed engineer with an expression of profound disbelief. "Mr. Pendleton?" Commander Arthur nodded respectfully, taking a slow sip from his cup. "I apologize for the mess. The acoustics in this place are frankly terrible, and the wiring is an absolute fire hazard." Reynolds cracked a wide, disbelieving grin. "We intercepted your broadcast, sir. You just single-handedly dismantled the Coalition's shadow intelligence network, exposed a century of black operations, and shut down their most secure fortress. How the hell did you manage to do all of that from inside an absolute vacuum?" Arthur looked back over his shoulder at the dark, smoking corridors of Oak Haven, the invincible prison that was now nothing more than a broken shell. He turned back to the Marines, the amber emergency lights reflecting in his eyes. "They built a perfect cage, Commander," Arthur said quietly, "but they forgot one basic rule of engineering." "What's that?" Reynolds asked. "Nothing in this universe is unbreakable," Arthur said, stepping forward to join the Marines, "especially when you lock a human inside with it. If you enjoyed this thrilling dive into human ingenuity and science fiction drama, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to support Arthur's incredible escape, share this tale with your fellow sci-fi enthusiasts, and subscribe to our channel for more epic HFY content, mind-bending twists, and original interstellar stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new adventure. We upload incredible new stories every week. See you in the stars.
Hi, my name is Tran Truong, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, they locked a human in the maximum security cell. By morning, the guards were hostages. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling was curiosity mixed with excitement. Stories like this are fun because they challenge expectations and show how quickly a situation can turn upside down. Watching the assumptions of others unravel is one of the things that makes HFY stories so entertaining. One gentle lesson I took from the story is that confidence and capability are often hidden beneath the surface. We don't always know what someone is capable of just by looking at them or judging their circumstances. In everyday life, it's a good reminder to stay open-minded and avoid making quick assumptions. What moment surprised you the most? And if you were one of the guards, at what point would you have realised things were about to go very differently? Thank you for spending time with Palace Truths. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and maybe like or subscribe for more HFY stories and sci-fi adventures.